Namaskar, I am Pradeep Gokhale from Central University of Tibetan Studies, Sarnath. The module that we are going to discuss is entitled Issues in Indian Logic, a Brief Outline. This module has been written by me. Now, this module is in fact the first module of the Indian Logic course that is being given under EPG Pathshala program. In this particular module can be regarded as introductory module, in the sense that here we are having an overview of different issues and topics which will be discussed in the course called Indian Logic. The first issue that we will be concerned with is, when we are dealing with Indian logic, we call it logic. Now, in what sense do we call Indian logic logic? There is a basic difference between the ways in which the two disciplines, namely Western formal logic and Indian logic, can be studied. Formal logic in the West has developed as a more or less uniform scientific subject, and hence its modern developed form can be studied without attaching importance to history. We will be dealing with Indian logic, however, in its historical context. This is partly because Indian logic has not developed uniformly as an independent scientific subject. It still exists in a divided form, as for example Nyaya logic, Buddhist logic and Jaina logic. That is, these different systems of logic are still inseparable from the epistemological metaphysical schools to which they belong. Though the terminology used by different theorists is common to a large extent, the treatment given to this terminology differs from theory to theory. To talk about a single logical theory in the name of Indian logic will therefore be incorrect and misleading. In the West, logic developed as a separate discipline from other disciplines such as ontology, epistemology and rhetoric. In India, however, logic arose as a part of Vada Vidya, theory of debate, and then it was often discussed as a part of Pramana Shastra, epistemology, but generally it was not an independent discipline. So, Indian logic is not formal in the strict sense of the term. The goal of inference in Indian logic was to reach true cognition or proving the truth of a cognition, and not either reaching validity or proving validity. So, these are some of the features which distinguish Indian logic from Western logic. Now, as I said, Indian logic is many times discussed as a part of Indian epistemology. But still, we have to make a distinction between Indian epistemology and Indian logic. How? Indian epistemology is concerned with many topics such as the definition of pramana in general, the theory of truth, that is pramanya, the number and kinds of pramanas and the definitions and classification of specific pramanas. But when we say Indian logic, in Indian logic we are concerned with only one pramana, namely Anumana. Now, even when one talks about Anumana, one can distinguish between epistemological and logical approaches to Anumana. We are here, when we are dealing with logic, we are concerned with Anumana more as a form of argument than as a kind of cognition. Here, therefore, our general policy in the Indian logic components of the two logic papers will be to discuss Indian theories of inference with their epistemological, rhetorical and logical aspects, and at the same time emphasize the logical aspect wherever possible. As I suggested, one can have two different approaches to Anumana. One way is to start with the theory of controversy, that is debate, and then discuss the uses of arguments in debate, and then approach Anumana as a kind of evidence, that is pramana, which can be given in debate. This is how initially the theory of pramanas was developed, even before the classic aphorismic text of Nyaya Sutra was written by Akshapada Gautama. An early form of Nyaya as a theory of controversy was being discussed and practiced by early dialecticians, the roots of which can be traced in the Mahabharata and the Charaka Samhita. Gradually, as epistemological issues became central to Indian philosophical discussions, Anumana was discussed more in its epistemological context rather than in the context of controversy. This gives us the other approach to the theory of Anumana, where we focus on the epistemological context and discuss Anumana as pramana. This second approach will be emphasized in the course on Indian logic. Now, when we say that Anumana has to be central to Indian logic, at the same time we have also to keep in mind that in Indian epistemology, although almost every system accepts Anumana as pramana, they also accept other pramanas which are comparable with Anumana. So, out of the four pramanas accepted by Nyaya, Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana and Shabda, Vaisheshikas accept two, namely Pratyaksha and Anumana, but then Vaisheshikas say that Upamana and Shabda are reducible to Anumana. Similarly, Mimamsa school, founded by Kumarila Bhatta, accepts six pramanas by adding Arthapatti and Anupalabdhi to the Nyaya list. Nayayikas try to reduce Arthapatti to a kind of Anumana and Anupalabdhi to a kind of Pratyaksha. On the other hand, Buddhists try to reduce Anupalabdhi to Anumana. They regard Anupalabdhi as a kind of Hetu in Anumana. Now, if by Indian logic we understand the study of Anumana Pramana, then it should also include the study of the types of indirect knowledge other than Anumana, namely Shabda, Upamana, Anupalabdhi and Arthapatti, at least to the extent to which they are reducible to Anumana. Now, we have to understand Indian logic as something which developed through controversies, through debates among different schools of philosophy. The Indian theory of inference has developed historically through intersystemic and intrasystemic discussions and debates. The leading parties in this historical debate have been Nyaya and Buddhism. Nyaya, of course, has played a pioneering role in this process. The Nyaya theory of pramanas in general and Anumana in particular is found in its early form in Nyaya Sutra of Gautama and Nyaya Bhashya of Vatsyayana. To the Nyaya theory of the early stage, there were two types of reactions from the Buddhists. The Madhyamika Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who belonged to 2nd century, using the dialectical method, questioned the very possibility of pramanas. This gave rise to a non-classical approach to logic and methodology, that is called Prasanga Paddhati. The other reaction to the early Nyaya theory of inference was aimed at its radicalization and systematization. It came from the Buddhist logician Dinnaga. Now, Dinnaga played a pioneering role in the development of Buddhist logic. Dinnaga argued for two and only two pramanas, namely Pratyaksha and Anumana, and explained their nature in a different way from the realistic way of Nyaya. According to Dinnaga, Pratyaksha has unique particulars as its object, and Anumana has universals, that is, shareable characteristics, as its object. For explaining the relationship between Hetu and Sadhya, that is, between the sign and the signified, Dinnaga introduced notions such as Paksha, Sapaksha, Vipaksha, and in terms of these ideas, he asserted that a good Hetu should be existent in Paksha, then outside that Paksha it should be existent only in Sapaksha, that is similar cases, and it should never be existent in dissimilar cases, that is Vipaksha. This was called the doctrine of triple character of Hetu, that is Hetu trairūpya, introduced by Dinnaga. Now, Dinnaga's doctrine of the trairūpya of Hetu was seriously debated among the succeeding non-Buddhist as well as Buddhist logicians. The Nyayikas argued that it is possible that the Sadhya may not exist in the locus in spite of the Hetu possessing the triple character. Hence, they pleaded for 5 characteristics instead of 3. This line was followed after Udyotakara by Nyaya logicians like Jayanta Bhatta, Bhasarvajna and Vachaspati Mishra. On the other hand, Dharmakirti, the Buddhist logician, did not deny the triple character of Hetu, but asserted that this triple character must be based on the universal and necessary relation between Hetu and Sadhya. Then, on the third side, Jaina logicians like Akalanka, Manikyanandin, Vadideva and many others questioned the doctrine of triple character of Hetu by asserting that the Hetu in fact has to fulfill only one condition, namely Anyathanupapatti, that is, non-explicability of Hetu without Sadhya. Dinnaga, in his systematization of Anumana, conceived of 9 possible ways of Hetu's existence and non-existence in Sapaksha and Vipaksha, which he called the wheel of Hetus, that is Hetu Chakra. He got these 9 possibilities in this way. With reference to existence in similar cases, there are 3 possibilities. The Hetu may exist in all similar cases, in only a few similar cases, or in none of the similar cases. In the same way, there are 3 possibilities with reference to existence in dissimilar cases. By combining the 3 possibilities of the 2 types with each other, we get 9 possibilities in all. Now we find that after Dinnaga came the Nyaya logician Udyotakara, who pointed out that this list of possibilities is incomplete, as it does not take into account the possibility that the similar cases or dissimilar cases may not be existent at all. This gave rise to the possibility of 3 kinds of Anumana: only positive, only negative, and positive negative. Now, after Dharmakirti's insistence that a good inference should be based on universal pervasion relation, sarvopa samharena vyaptihi, logicians of all the schools incorporated the notion of universal Vyapti with both positive and negative forms in their theories of inference. So, different questions about the nature and knowledge of Vyapti could be asked. One question is, of the 2 types of Vyapti, which is basic, the negative one or the positive one? Or are both to be treated independently and collectively? On this, Buddhists and Jainas would respond that the negative form is basic, which they described as avinabhava and anyathanupapatti respectively. Mimamsakas would say that positive form is basic, which is cognized through repeated observation. Nayayikas, in most of the inferences we find Nayayikas would say that in most of the inferences we find both forms of Vyapti. There are some inferences in which we find only the positive form of Vyapti. There are some inferences in which we find only the negative form of Vyapti. This is one point of controversy. There was also a controversy over the question of the means to the knowledge of Vyapti or ascertainment of Vyapti. Mimamsakas would say Vyapti can be known through repeated observation. Nayayikas would say extraordinary type of perception or mental perception or ordinary perception and non-perception is the means to the knowledge of Vyapti. Buddhists would say that it is a kind of mental construction which is based on necessary relation between Hetu and Sadhya. Jainas would say that no, an independent pramana is needed for explaining the knowledge of Vyapti, and they call this pramana as tarka. Now, against all this, all these schools were engaged with explaining how the knowledge of Vyapti is possible, how the ascertainment of Vyapti is possible. There were Charvakas who were skeptical about this exercise of inference as pramana. So, they would say that this whole discourse on Vyapti rested on the presupposition that there are universal relational truths called Vyapti relations, and they can be known for certain by ordinary human beings. Now, this presupposition was questionable according to Charvakas, who can be described as mitigated skeptics, who questioned the very authenticity of Anumana. Some of the Charvakas claim that Anumana can give only probability, but no certainty. This seed of thought, which could have caused the development of inductive logic and the probability theory, unfortunately could not sprout in the tradition of Indian logic. Charvakas, as popularly understood, criticized and denied Anumana as pramana. But, as some scholars have pointed out, there were at least some Charvaka philosophers who accepted a certain kind of inference, although they denied speculative metaphysical inferences about, say, God, Atman, other worlds. They accepted some inferences. They did this by classifying inference into two kinds, verifiable and non-verifiable. That is, utpanna pratiti and utpadya pratiti, or sometimes by classifying inference into commonsensical and trans-commonsensical. That is, loka prasiddha anumana and what can be called lokatita anumana. So this brings us to the question of classification of Anumana, classification of Hetus, classification of inferences. So different schools of logic classified Hetu and Anumana with different purposes. We have seen that Charvakas classified inference into verifiable and non-verifiable, commonsensical and trans-commonsensical inference. But the difference between this classification and other classifications was that this classification was aimed at dissociating acceptable inferences from non-acceptable inferences. Because for them, verifiable inference is acceptable, non-verifiable inference is not acceptable. Commonsensical inference is acceptable, trans-commonsensical inference is not acceptable. Whereas other systems gave different classifications of inference, not in order to show that some inferences are acceptable and some are not, but they gave classification of what were acceptable inferences according to them. For example, early Nyaya and Sankhya gives us a classification of inferences into Purvavat, Sheshavat and Samanyato Drushta. Dharmakirti, in his theory of inference, gives us classification of inference into Swabhavanumana and Karyanumana. Then Nayayikas, after Udyotakara, give the classification of inference into Kevalanvayi, that is purely positive, Kevala Vyatireki, purely negative, and Anvaya Vyatireki, that is positive negative. And we find that Jaina logicians have given a very elaborate classification of Hetus. They gave classification of Hetus into 25 kinds. So we now come to a different topic, which is also an important topic, and that is the steps in the argument. While explaining Anumana as argument, that is what can be called Pararthanumana, the Nayayikas gave the formula of 5-step argument, that is Pratidnya, Hetu, Drishtanta, Upanaya and Nigamana. For example, suppose somebody is proving the existence of fire on the mountain. When he sees smoke on the mountain, he will argue the mountain has fire, this will be Pratidnya. Because it has smoke, this will be Hetu. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire. For example, in the kitchen, this will be Drishtanta. Of course, this will be positive Drishtanta, Anvaya Drishtanta. Vyatireka Drishtanta will be wherever there is no fire, there is no smoke, like in a waterful lake. Then Upanaya will be likewise the mountain has smoke, or in the case of Vyatireka Drishtanta it will be but the mountain does not lack smoke, and ultimately there will be conclusion, therefore the mountain has fire. Now this particular model of 5-step formula, 5-step argument, which was presented by Nayayikas, was questioned later on by Buddhists and other logicians of other schools. Dinnaga, for example, tried to systematize the nature of argument as consisting of 3 steps: Paksha, Hetu and Drishtanta. Then Dharmakirti, who underlined universal and necessary relation of Vyapti, introduced the formula of 2-step argument consisting of the statements of Paksha Dharmata and Vyapti. He regarded even conclusion as redundant because it necessarily followed from the premises. Then Jainas came out with a different formula. They insisted on a 2-step formula, but in their formula, Paksha and Hetu were the 2 steps. There was another point of controversy, a related point, namely, should Drishtanta be a part of the argument? Nayayikas insisted that yes, it should be a part of argument. Dharmakirti insisted that no, Drishtanta is not a necessary element in argument. Similarly, the controversy over the steps in an argument had implications for the types of fallacies. If you accept 3-step argument, then 3 kinds of fallacies. So Dinnaga accepted Paksha, Hetu and Drishtanta as the 3 steps, and corresponding 3 types of fallacies also: Pakshabhasa, Hetuvabhasa, Drishtantavhasa. But when the role of Paksha and Drishtanta in an argument was not given importance, but Hetu was given central importance, then Hetuvabhasa became the central notion representing inferential fallacies. Now, in Indian logic, as we started, that different systems developed different approaches to reasoning, and therefore we have different forms of Indian logic. Indian logic is not just uniform system, but in Indian logic we have different systems. So Jainas had their contribution to Indian logic, and it was a different type of contribution, a unique contribution. On the one hand, of course, they contributed to the classical theory of Anumana, but the more characteristic contribution of Jaina logicians was in terms of their doctrines of Syadvada and Nayavada, which were concerned with non-classical and informal aspects of Indian logic. By introducing the theory of Syadvada, which is interpreted by some modern logicians in terms of modal logic, because it applied the prefix Syat, literally, which means maybe. which in its technical sense means kathanchit, that is in a way. So through this theory, according to some interpreters, Jainas were introducing some kind of many-valued logic because it primarily accepted three possibilities in the case of any phenomenon, that you can say that the phenomenon is, you can say the phenomenon is not, or you can say that the phenomenon is inexpressible, avaktavya. Then Jainas also presented a theory of Nyaya and Nayabhasa, that is the theory of judgment and fallacy of judgment, which is important from the point of view of informal logic. Now, this is all this that we have discussed so far belongs to what can be called pre-Navya Nyaya period. From Nyaya point of view, one can say that after 10th century, there was a rise of what can be called Navya Nyaya, that is neo-logic. That is within Nyaya tradition, there was a kind of a revolution in terms of technical terminology of logic, and in terms of interpretation, in terms of definitions. So many new things came to surface, and therefore we have to take into account the contribution of Navya Nyaya to Indian logic. Now, what is the contribution of Navya Nyaya? We can say that it is twofold contribution. The Navya Nyaya philosophers accepted the ontological framework of the Vaisheshika system. That is, Vaisheshika system initially presented 6 categories or 6 padarthas, then it added abhava as a category, so we have 7 padarthas in the Vaisheshika system. So Navya Nayayikas accepted those 7 categories so far as the ontological framework is concerned, and fitted the Nyaya epistemology of 4 pramanas into it. So they tried to systematically synthesize Vaisheshika ontology with Nyaya epistemology. This is one important contribution of Navya Nayayikas. Second important contribution is that Navya Nyaya philosophers developed a technical vocabulary by using which a clear and precise definition and description of any given phenomenon becomes possible. In addition to the 7 padarthas, which their traditional subclassification, with their traditional subclassification, the Nayayikas discovered or invented many relational categories which were ultimately subsumed under the 7 categories. For example, Navya Nayayikas introduced a relation called Swarupa Sambandha, or it can also be described as Visheshanata Sambandha. Then Avachedakata, then Pratiyogita Anuyogita, then Nirupyata Nirupakata, Vyapti, Vishayita Vishayata, Visheshyata Visheshanata, and also Kalika Sambandha. So they introduced various kinds of relations and tried to, of course, reduce them ontologically. From ontological point of view, they were reducible to 7 categories, but from the point of view of logical terminology, they were new discoveries or new inventions, and with the help of the use of these technical terms, Nayayikas, Navya Nayayikas tried to define, tried to describe various kinds of facts, various kinds of situations in a most clear and precise way. So this is another area which will be discussed in the Indian logic course. Now, third important area is the context of debate. Here, one of the questions is whether the consideration of truth, validity, and soundness, which are important for epistemology and logic, should have a bearing on the successes and failures in a controversy, or the persuasive power and other influential powers of debaters should have the decisive role. So, how logic should account in debate? That is an important question. Then, about this, Gautama in Nyaya Sutra gave a threefold classification of discussion: Vada, Jalpa, and Vitanda. He elaborated on the practices and rules of debate under the heads Chala, Jati, and Nigrasthana. Gautama had prescribed even the last two types of debate, namely Jalpa and Vitanda, for protecting one's own doctrine, like a fence one puts up with thorny branches for protecting one's field. Dharmakirti was opposed to this view, and hence we have a controversy over the rules of debate between Nayayikas and Buddhists. The question of interrelation between logic and rhetoric of debate becomes a key issue in this context. The next issue that we are going to discuss in this course is what can be called the comparison between Indian logic and modern Western logic. In modern times, the scholars of Indian philosophy who were interested in its logical, analytical aspects rather than religious aspects, that is, there was a time when Indian philosophy was identified with Vedanta, with metaphysics, with mysticism. But later on there was a period when some scholars pointed out that Indian philosophy is not just Vedanta, it is not just religious philosophy, it is not just mysticism, but logical, epistemological, analytical discussions are also a core part of Indian logic, and therefore they emphasized Nyaya as the core of Indian logic. So now the question arose that in Indian philosophy, in Indian tradition, we have Nyaya, we have logic in some form, we have analysis in some form, but then is this logic of the same nature as Western logic, or it is basically different? So some modern scholars try to assimilate Indian logic with Aristotelian logic. Some modern scholars try to understand Nyaya logic in terms of modern symbolic logic. So these attempts give rise to some issues in comparative logic. So what are the issues in comparative logic? Inference for oneself as well as that for others is explained in the Nyaya theory not in terms of logical relations among propositions, but as a causal psychological relation among cognitive episodes. Hence, it was the question of whether Indian logic should be regarded as deficient to the extent to which it does not give an adequate account of the concept of proposition, or it should be treated as a different type of logic, as a logic of cognition rather than cognition of logic of proposition. Similarly, there was a question whether it should be regarded as deficient, that is, Indian logic should be regarded as deficient as it falls prey to psychologism, or psychologism should not be regarded as a fault insofar as it does not hamper the logical relations between premises and conclusion. Here we see scholars like B.K. Matilal and J.N. Mohanty trying to make a case for Indian logic as a distinct but legitimate form of logic. Now, at the same time, in contemporary period, we find that Dayakrishna, another important contemporary Indian philosopher, although he did not take a specific stand on this issue, he took initiative in establishing a dialogue on the concept of proposition between the traditional Pandits who elaborated on Nyāya and modern scholars of philosophical analysis who elaborated on Russell's theory of description. So, by conducting such a trialogue, Daya Krishna tried to explore the possibility of there being points of contact between our Nyaya tradition on the one hand and analytical tradition of the West on the other hand. Now, the concept of proposition recently ceased to be central to Western logic and is many a time replaced by the concept of sentence. So, there is a trend in Western logic now that proposition is not regarded as a central, but sentence is regarded as central. So, which will have further implications for the comparison between the two logics. So far we have just had a kind of overview of different issues and topics which are important for the study of Indian logic. An attempt will be made in the 40 modules, out of which of course this is the first module on Indian logic, to discuss as many aspects, as many topics, as many issues in Indian logic as possible on the basis of sometimes in historical perspective, sometimes in purely logical perspective, and sometimes in comparative perspective. For further study, you may refer to the e-text of this particular module and also the references which are given at the end for additional help.